Olá, que tal? We are going to show you how to estimate seismic phase components from the time transform. My name is Marcílio from Seismic Research Consulting and Training Company in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm also co-pilot of the ASP Consortia at the University of Oklahoma. My co-author is Professor Marford from the University of Oklahoma. We are going to follow this summary. Why phasing is important for interpreters? This schematic diagram from the Alistair Brown book shows the zero-phase response of hydrocarbon reservoirs for different acoustic contrasts between the reservoir and the embedded medium. Comparing this bright spot representation here with this one here, we can clearly see a phase change between the background reflector at the top of the reservoir. Complementing the previous slide, this figure shows a real data example from Malaysia with a beautiful bright spot showing a gas trapped against a shale diapir with an interesting polarity reversal. We can see here the background reflection, the phase reversal here, and also a beautiful flat spot here. Another example is the phase rotation due to thin bed. Considering that each trace of this wedge model can be represented by the wavelet ut minus the wavelet delayed by delta t, the thickness, we can approximate the wavelet in the tuning region by the derivative of the wavelet. Knowing that the Fourier transform of the derivative is expressed by this way, we know that each phase is rotated by 90 degrees because of the J complex factor here. Joint time frequency analysis is a way to see how the frequency spectrum varies along time. I would say that the first time frequency representation was the musical notation that describes how the musical tones, frequency, phase, and magnitude vary along the time. For the musicians, the frequency of the tones, the duration, and the intensity. In this figure here, we show the correspondence between the musical notation and the time frequency representation. Independent of the technique we used, the time frequency decomposition shows us how the spectrum varies along the time or depth, and this creates time frequency patterns that can be associated with important events like the reservoir target area for this real trace time frequency decomposition. Actually, we are going to show you how we can obtain the time representation from the S transform. We are going to use this synthetic model and this seismic trace to show you how we evaluate the seismic phase. As a reference, this is the instantaneous phase evaluated as the arctangent of the complex trace. From the instantaneous phase, we can derive the wavelet phase or response phase guided by the envelope. Actually, we split the seismic trace into several small intervals between each local minimum and assign the instantaneous phase at the peak magnitude as the phase response. We are going to use this concept to create our local phase from the TT transform. Stockwell and his buddies proposed the S transform by using this equation here that can be interpreted as a short-time Fourier transform if we use a special window, sliding window here that is a function of the frequency. When we apply the S transform to this seismic trace, that seismic trace from the tuning region from the wedge model, we can see the magnitude spectrum in this figure and the phase spectrum in this. Perfect reconstruction is an important property of the S transform. This equation here shows how we can evaluate it. So look at this unusual way to show the S transform coefficients by their real and imaginary parts we can see that the inner brackets here is the stacking of the complex coefficients in this direction along the time. And the inner integral here is the simply inverse Fourier transform of the previous summation. By this way, we can get the inverse seismic trace. If we rewrite the inverse S transform equation by this way, now the inner braces represent the inverse Fourier transform of each time or depth S transform coefficients. Actually, of each line of the S transform matrix. The outer integration is simply stacking of the previous evaluated matrix along the time direction. Please note that different from the previous slides, the inner braces evaluation results in a 2D matrix with both indices being the function of the time. To keep visually the reconstructed trace vertical, we rotated here the inner integral result. By this way, the inverse transforms the stacking of the matrix columns. Look at the same matrix as wiggles. We can interpret the wiggles as local wavelets. Pinegar and Mansinha called this intermediate step the time-time transform. Basically, every line of S-transform coefficients in the frequency domain, which represents a local spectrum at time t, turns into a local seismic trace in time at time t. The stacking of all these local traces reconstructs the seismic trace. So, zooming at the sum events, we can see clearly how the local wavelets compose the real trace and invite us to special stacking selections. Let's look first to this reflector, the first reflector. We can see here that the composition of it is mainly by zero phase wavelets, local zero phase wavelets. Let's look at the second one, which represents a thin bed, which is an interference between the top and bottom of the wedge model. And let's look at the wavelets, local wavelets that stacks this reflector. We can see, for instance, zero phase wavelets, minus 180 degrees wavelets, as expected, is interfering, stacking and interfering each other. And we can also see some 90 degrees phase rotated local wavelets, which is great. And looking at the bottom reflector, as expected, we see mostly the 180 degrees phase. Our main goal is to show you how we can label each local wavelet and stack them by using some user-guided criteria. In this case, the label is the wavelet phase or phase response of each local wavelet. Before, we should note that each local wavelet is not necessarily centered at the corresponding local time. Let's look at this point, for instance, and we can see here the local wavelet corresponding to the 0.19 seconds. And in this case, it's clearly at the same equivalent time, but if we look at the 0.15 seconds wavelet, local wavelet, we can see that's not necessarily centered at 0.15 seconds. Okay, let's plot over the TT transform represented here by image and here by wiggles, the instantaneous phase of all the local wavelets. And how can we estimate the local wavelet phase or the phase response? Is by picking, as we showed before, the phase at the peak envelope of each trace. Let's look, for instance, at this trace that's after stacked represent the twin beds. We can clearly see here that the phase rotates from the 0 phase here to 90 degrees and then to 180 degrees. After we applied this process, we created actually two different attributes, the local wavelet phase and the local wavelet magnitude, which is the peak of all these envelopes. This figure shows the local wavelet phase instantaneous attribute applied to the wedge model. We can clearly see in the tuning region that the phase rotates from 0 to 90 degrees and then to 180 degrees. This is the local wavelet magnitude that shows a high amplitude in the tuning region too. This is the corrended phase magnitude and seismic amplitude. It's nice to see the 0 phase here and the 90 degrees rotation here and the minus 180 degrees in the bottom of the wedge model. Taking advantage of the opportunity, we also evaluated the local wavelet frequency, which is the frequency at the peak envelope, and the peak delay time, that is the delay between the current sample and the peak magnitude. Observe here in this example that the 0 peak delay time corresponds to the peaking of the reflectors. And as we observed before, it's not necessarily 0. Guided by the local wavelet phase attribute, here we selected the phase range from 70 to 110 degrees to stack the local wavelets. And this is the result. It's really cool that we actually selected all the local wavelet phase around 90 degrees, showing clearly the tuning region of this wedge model. In this figure, we selected the phase range from minus 70 degrees to 70 degrees. And the phase components indicates clearly the top reflector and the top of the wedge model. And this figure shows the phase range from minus 110 degrees to plus 110 degrees. And this confirms that the bottom reflector and the bottom reflector of the wedge shows the 180 degrees phase rotation. Now let's apply the technique to a real seismic data from Canterbury Basin, New Zealand, WACA 3D. Considering this data is using reverse polarity or European polarity, we can see clearly both in the time slice and in the vertical CDP section a beautiful bright spot here. We can also view the bright spot in the inline. These figures shows the local wavelet magnitude and phase attributes computed using our workflow. The wavelet magnitude show very beautiful features like the bright spot here and also several other small channels features. And the phase shows exactly what we expected about the phase rotating in the bright spot region. Correlating the phase and magnitude, we see the phase only where the magnitude is high. This beautiful figure here confirms our assumption about the phase rotation at the bright spot. We can also use these attributes, this combination, to create, for instance, nice geobodies. And actually, we are going to use it to select the phase range that we are going to split the seismic data or decompose the seismic data. guided by this phase information. As we did before for the wedge model, here we rendered the local phase, local magnitude, and as we go, the phase components, the 0-degree phase components actually around this phase range. And we can clearly see the phase rotation above and below the target region, and also the phase rotation laterally from this magenta color to this green color on both sides of around the flat spot here. Here we show the 90 degrees phase components. We can see the same phase rotation, equivalent phase rotation. Here the 180 degrees phase components, and there the minus 90 degrees phase components. Let's look at the phase components of the time slice we showed before. The first one is the minus 90 degrees, the second one is the 0 phase degree, the third is the 90 degrees, where we can clearly see the bright spots, and the last one is the 180 degrees. The stacking of these local phase components is exactly the seismic amplitude as we showed before. Concluding, TT transform creates a sample-by-sample local wavelet that, after stacked, reconstructs perfectly the original trace. Considering that the local wavelet phase is the peak phase of the local wavelet, we can stack selected local wavelets by their phase range. Ideally, the phase range should be target-oriented. Remember, this is a trace-by-trace algorithm, and is ready for multidimensional data like pre-stacking and multi-azimuthal data. Special thanks for ASPE sponsors, for Petrobras, the main seismic client, and for the New Zealand Petroleum Minerals for providing the seismic data. Muchas gracias por la atención. Feel free to send me any questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you very much again.